Picture this. It's hell. Millions of demons are crawling out of the lake of fire after falling through space for 9 days straight. They're in agony, they're defeated, and their leader, Satan himself, just woke up, and his first act is to give a speech about how actually this is fine, because it's better to be a king in hell than a servant in heaven. And then they immediately start building a golden palace and then holding a democratic vote about whether to invade the new universe that God had just created. That is the opening of Paradise Lost. And it's the most craziest thing ever written by a blind Puritan in 1667. John Milton's Paradise Lost is the poem that invented the devil as we know him today. Before this, Satan was basically just a monster. He had horns, a pitchfork. He was the medieval demon, like the little red guy. After this, Satan became a character. He got motivations, a psychological backing, an entire backstory explaining how a perfect angel became the embodiment of evil. And Milton did something that was either genius or heresy, depending on who you ask. He let Satan tell his own story, make his own case, explain his own reasoning, and he gave the devil a voice. And what's wild is that this is a deeply religious work by a Puritan revolutionary who was literally in hiding from the king who wanted him executed. Milton's trying to make sense of evil itself, trying to understand how pride disguises itself as righteousness, and trying to answer why anyone would choose hell over heaven. The result is this massive epic poem that has 12 books, over 10,000 lines. Mine has like 350 or so pages that tells the story of everything from the war in heaven to the creation of earth to the Garden of Eden to the fall of humanity and the promise of its redemption. It's Genesis, but filled with all the dramatic details that the Bible leaves out. So what did Satan actually say to convince a third of the heaven's angels to rebel? What was Adam thinking when Eve handed him the fruit? What does hell even look like, and what did demons do all day? Well, Milton has answers, and they are insane. Now, before we dive in, I need to establish a couple things up front. First, and I cannot stress this enough, this is not scripture. This is just poetry. This is John Milton's theological imagination working through the biblical themes. So when Milton has Satan giving these elaborate speeches or describes the layout of hell or invents conversations between Adam and Eve, he's not claiming to be divinely inspired. He's writing fiction based on biblical events. So when we get to the parts where Milton characterizes demons or fills in backstory, understand that this is his creative interpretation, not biblical doctrine. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking, but I'm not going to stand here or sit here and say this is definitely what happened. The second thing is, I'm also a Christian, and we're about to spend the next probably hour and a half talking about angels, demons, Satan, and the fall of man, and a bunch of other weighty spiritual stuff. And I'm going to treat that seriously and very reverently, but I'm also going to crack jokes sometimes because this poem has demons building a golden palace in hell and arguing about politics. And there's even one part where Satan spends one scene disguised as a frog whispering into Eve's ear while she's asleep. And if I don't occasionally acknowledge just how wild this gets, we're all going to be exhausted. So just know that when I make light of something, it's not out of disrespect. It's just me trying to keep us sane during a very, very long and heavy story. And so with those caveats out of the way, let me tell you what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going through all 12 books of Paradise Lost. We're going to see how Satan and millions of demons are crawling out of the lake of fire and building a civilization in hell. And we're also going to be watching a war in heaven where archangels fight with the power of colliding planets. Then we're also going to be going through the Garden of Eden before everything went wrong and then watch it all fall apart firsthand. And then we're also going to see why this poem has haunted Western culture for nearly 300 years. This is going to be a long one, probably one of my longer videos, but Paradise Lost deserves it because you cannot rush the story. So if you're here for it, settle in, and thank you to all of you who are subscribed. If you enjoy deep dives into the weird parts of the Bible and other things like it, then you're in the right place. So hit subscribe if you haven't yet. And yeah, without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, let's talk about the devil. But first, we need to talk about the man who wrote him, because you can't understand Paradise Lost without understanding the man, John Milton, and his life. What he believed, what he fought for, and what he lost. And trust me, his story is almost as dramatic as the poem itself. To him, this wasn't this detached academic exercise in theology. This was a deeply personal work for him, because this is a man who is processing trauma, political disillusionment, and his own potential damnation through poetry. And the context of his life is so wild that it honestly deserves its own section, and it's crucial for understanding the book. So, John Milton is born in 1608 in London. In London. His father is a composer, wealthy guy, and he gives John the best education that money can buy. And Milton is, quite honestly, brilliant. Like, genuinely, one of those polymaths who makes you feel bad about yourself. Like, he was that smart. And by the time he's a teenager, he's fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, and French. He goes to Cambridge University, and he's clearly destined for something, but he's also kind of insufferable. He's argumentative, he's stubborn, he's convinced that he's smarter than everyone around him, which, to be fair, he probably was, but that doesn't make you fun at parties. After university, instead of becoming a minister or whatever his family wanted, he just studies. For 6 years, he's living at home, reading everything he can get his hands on, and then writing poetry. And then in 1638, he decides to do the Grand Tour. That thing that wealthy English people did where they traveled around Europe pretending to learn culture. He goes to Italy. He's reading Dante, which I should probably do a video on Dante's Inferno too. But, he's reading Virgil. He's reading Ovid. He's soaking up all this classic literature. And while he's in Italy, he meets a gentleman by the name of Galileo. Galileo, by the way, who's under house arrest for saying that the earth goes around the sun. And this encounter sticks it with Milton because he writes about it later in Paradise Lost, actually. There's like this whole reference to Galileo's telescope. But the important thing is that this idea is forming in Milton's mind, that the church can actually be wrong about fundamental things, that truth can exist outside of religious authority, specifically the Catholic Church. And that questioning power isn't blasphemy to him. To him, it's necessary. And I want you to keep that in mind because it becomes pretty crucial to understanding what he's doing with Satan's rebellion. So Milton then comes back to England in 1639, and the country is falling apart. King Charles I has dissolved Parliament, so he's ruling by divine right, whatever that means, meaning God alone gave him the authority, not the people. And as you can imagine, this doesn't sit well with a lot of people, Milton included. So the country erupts into a civil war. You have the royalists versus the parliamentarians. And Milton goes all in on the parliamentary side. He starts writing these radical and political pamphlets. And I mean radical for the 1600s, which is saying something. So he's arguing for the freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to divorce. He'd gotten married and his wife left him after a month. So he was dealing with some stuff. And eventually, the right to execute tyrannical kings. That last one is important because in 1649, they bring King Charles I to trial. They convict him of treason against his own people. And on January 30th, 28 days after my birthday in 1649, they beheaded him in the streets of London. The monarchy ends up being abolished. England becomes a republic, or the Commonwealth, under a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And Milton becomes a government official. So he's appointed Secretary for Foreign Tongues, which basically means he's writing propaganda for the new republic in Latin, defending the execution of the king to the rest of Europe, engaging in these, pamphlet wars with royalist scholars. And so he's living his principles. He's part of the revolution. But then in 1652, everything changes. Milton, unfortunately, goes completely blind. So he's 43 years old, but he's a writer and he can't see. So there's some debate about what could have caused it. Like it could have been glaucoma, it could have been genetic, could have been all the reading by candlelight, which he did a lot of. But whatever the cause, he's now totally blind and he's devastated. There's this sonnet that he writes about it where he's basically asking God, how am I supposed to serve you if I can't see? How am I supposed to use this talent that you've given me if you've taken away my ability to use it? So, that's a little heartbreaking no matter who you are. But nonetheless, he keeps working. He learns to dictate everything. He hires assistants. He has his daughters read to him. He composes in his head and then speaks it out loud for someone to write down. And then in 1660, everything he fought for collapses. Oliver Cromwell dies. His son tries to take over, but he's incompetent. Eventually, the republic falls apart. And then the army brings back Charles II, the son of the executed king, and then restores the monarchy. And suddenly, Milton is a wanted man because he literally wrote pamphlets defending the execution of the king's father. And so eventually he's arrested. He's briefly imprisoned. All of his books are burned. And then he's eventually pardoned, probably because he was blind and not seen as much of a threat anymore. But nonetheless, he's politically destroyed. So everything he believed in, everything that he fought for, has ultimately failed. The tyrants won, and the good guys lost, so to speak. And it's in this state, blind, politically defeated, probably depressed, watching the restoration roll back on all the freedoms that he'd championed, that he starts composing Paradise Lost. He's been thinking about it for years, but he starts seriously working on it in the early 1660s. And then he dictates the entire thing to his daughters, line by line, night after night, from memory. All 12 books, over 10,000 lines of blank verse poetry. So when you read Paradise Lost, you're not just reading a retelling of Genesis per se, you are reading a man wrestling with despair. He's trying to understand how something that seemed so right, the Republic, the freedom, the rebellion against tyranny, could fail so completely. He's trying to make sense of why God would allow evil to triumph over good. And he frames all of that through the oldest story that he knows: the fall of the angels, the fall of humanity, and the promise of redemption. There's this question that hangs over the whole poem. How do you tell the difference between a righteous rebellion and Satan's rebellion? How do you know when it's time and when it's right to overthrow authority and when it's pride disguised as the principle? Milton had just lived through both. He'd supported what he thought was a righteous cause, and it led to tyranny under Cromwell, and then the restoration of the monarchy. So when he writes Satan's speeches about freedom and the resistance to tyranny, they sound good because Milton knows how to make them sound good, because he's written before about earthly kings. But as the story goes on, we see how those arguments start to change. How Satan's rhetoric about freedom is really about power, and how his talk of equality is really about supremacy. And I think that's what makes Paradise Lost so much more than just a Bible story retelling, because it's Milton working through his own trauma. I'm sounding like a Gen Z person here, and asking what went wrong? How did we go astray? How did we end up here? And so with that context in mind, let's get into the actual poem. And it actually starts about as crazy as you can get, with millions of demons crawling out of the lake of fire in hell. All right, so here's the thing about how Milton structures the story. He doesn't start at the beginning. He doesn't give you a chronological, in the beginning God created the angels, and then this happened, and then this happened. No. He actually drops you right into the quote-unquote media res, which is the middle of action. I'm pretty sure that's Latin, but with zero context. You're just suddenly in hell with Satan, and you, as the reader, have to piece together what happened through dialogue and flashbacks, which can sometimes be a mental strain. But, oh gosh, yes, it was. Well, but honestly, that's kind of the point. You're supposed to feel lost. Like, you're supposed to be figuring this out as you go. But fortunately for you guys, you don't have to do any of that, because I did it for you. Anyways, it mirrors the confusion of the fallen angels themselves. They're lying in fire. They're just trying to process what had happened to them. And so the poem starts, or opens with Satan, and then this character named Beelzebub lying in the lake of fire. More than likely, you know who Satan is, but you might not know who Beelzebub is. He was like a secondary demon who throughout history was also attributed to being Satan, but also a different being, and perhaps Baal himself, and they kind of make fun of his names, and that's like a whole thing. But the point is, they've been there for a while. The timeline Milton gives us is insane. So they fell from heaven for 9 days. Not 9 hours, 9 days. Falling through space for 9 days straight. And then, when they landed in the lake of fire and hell, they also just laid there for another 9 days in complete silence. I want you to sit on that particular point for a second. So, there's 18 days of processing here. You have 9 days of falling, probably in shock, probably not even fully understanding what the heck is going on, and then 9 more days just lying there in burning agony, fully conscious, unable to move or speak. You're just thinking. That's psychological torture on top of physical torture, it seems like. And when Satan finally speaks, you can actually feel the weight of those 18 days in his voice. Now, when Milton describes Satan and Beelzebub, he's also not describing them as human-sized. Satan is so massive that his form is compared to a ship. His shield is like the moon, his spear is like the mast of a ship, or maybe a Swedish pine tree, if that's even a thing. The point is, these are mountain-sized beings, which makes sense, right? Angels in their true form shouldn't be human scale, at least in fun thought. We're talking about entities that exist partially outside of normal physics here, that fought wars across dimensions. The fact that they can shrink down to human size later is like, that's the weird part, not them being huge. So Satan's lying there in the fire, and finally he speaks. His first words are to Beelzebub, who's called the Lord of the Flies, which is either a corruption of Beelzebul, meaning Lord of the House, or it's a mockery, meaning Lord of Dung. I would assume it's probably the latter. Either way, Beelzebub is Satan's right-hand demon, his second in command, and Satan basically says, if you're the same guy that I knew in heaven, if you're still you, if you still have your power, then yeah, we lost. But at least we're still ourselves. At least we still have our minds, our memories, and our strength, and we can use that to keep fighting. And then Satan says the line that becomes his entire philosophy for the pretty much like the rest of the story. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Now, the first time I read that, I was like, okay, I mean, that's kind of crazy. It's like, it's got this particular egoist energy. It's like the ultimate, I'd rather, die on my feet than live on my knees moment. But the more you sit with it, the more you realize how tragic it becomes. Because what Satan's really saying is, I would rather be miserable and in control than happy and under authority. So he's not saying in hell we're actually good or that we're better off here. He's rather saying, I'm so prideful that I would rather be in eternal torment as a king than in eternal bliss as a servant. So that's someone who's so broken by pride that they've lost the ability to conceive, what even happiness is outside of power. And the tragedy is that Satan knows this. He knows he's lying to himself. We'll see that more clearly later when he's in the Garden of Eden and he has this whole moment of crushing self-awareness. But here in the immediate aftermath, he's still in rationalization mode. He's trying to convince himself that he made the right choice. So Satan and Beelzebub pull themselves out of the fire and then they start flying across hell. And Milton describes the landscape and it's genuinely horrifying. It's not the medieval fire and brimstone cartoon version that probably Dante popularized. However, it's described as this vast, dark chasm with volcanoes and sulfurous fumes and this oppressive darkness that's somehow lit up by flames. It's just really gross in a way that makes your brain even hurt to picture it. And as they're flying, Satan looks down and he sees the rest of his army. A third of all the angels in heaven that fell with Satan. That's the biblical number from Revelation. A third of the stars fell from heaven, and the interpretation is that those stars are angels. So we are talking about millions, maybe billions of angels, all lying in the fire who are completely stunned. Also, quick tangent, I also have a little bit of a bone to pick with that third of the angels number, but that's probably for a different video. Essentially, there's this argument to be made that in Revelation 12, where it talks about this whole Satan falling with, the third of the angels thing, that if you read the context around what's going on in those verses, it seems to be actually talking about that this is taking place at the birth of the Messiah, not before the fall with Adam and Eve, before Adam and Eve. So where does that line up? I don't know. Anyways, Satan ends up landing on the shore. Well, there's no shore yet. It's just a less on fire part of hell is pretty much what I mean. And he calls out to them. He gives them this rallying, rousing speech, waking up millions of the demons. And they start emerging. They start coming out of the ground or out of the fire. These massive angelic forms start pulling themselves up. And then Milton names them. I think it's all of them. I can't quite remember. But this is where I thought it was rather interesting the first time I saw this, because these demons that he's talking about are not random demons. These are the beings who will later be worshipped as gods throughout the Old Testament. Moloch is mentioned by name. He was the Ammonite god who demanded child sacrifice, who shows up in Kings and Jeremiah as this abomination that Israel keeps falling away to worship. He also names Ashtoreth, who's also called Astarte, I think. And it's the Canaanite goddess of war and fertility, who shows up next to Baal all throughout Judges and Kings. And then there's Chemosh, the Moabite god, same deal. Dagon, the Philistine god, the one whose temple that Samson pulled down. And then, of course, you have Baal himself, Some people call him Baal, but no, Baal just sounds better. The primary rival god throughout the Old Testament, the one who's always luring Israel away from Yahweh. And then you've also got Mammon, who's associated with greed, greed, money, mammon, similar stuff. And Belial, who's associated with worthlessness or lawlessness. These names show up scattered all throughout Scripture and in Second Temple Jewish texts. And, here's Milton collecting them all and saying, these were all there. These were all angels who fell with Satan. Every false god, every demon, every spiritual enemy that humanity will face, they all trace back to this very moment. And if you're any kind of a Bible nerd, which, you clicked on this video, so you probably are, or at least somewhat interested, reading this section is rather strange. So it recontextualizes so much of the Old Testament. So anyways, these demons are all gathering, and they're picking up their weapons because apparently they kept their weapons from the war in heaven. Their shields, their spears, their banners, all scorched, on fire, damaged, but evidently still functional. And then they raise them in allegiance to Satan, and then Satan looks at his army, and I think he's feeling something like guilt. Milton says that Satan is, quote unquote, moved by seeing all of them there, suffering because they ultimately followed him. I think he almost feels like bad about it, almost. But then he swallows that up pretty quickly, and then he pushes forward because, what else is he going to do? Apologize, admit he was wrong? That would require humility. And he just finished saying that he'd rather reign in hell, so... Instead, he gives a rousing speech, another speech. And the speech is interesting because he's doing something that I don't even think that he realizes he's doing. He's trying to justify their suffering by giving it meaning. He's saying, yeah, we lost. Yes, we're in hell, but this isn't the end. We can still fight. We can still matter. We can still make a difference, even if that difference is just making God's life a little bit harder. It's sweet Cheez-Its. It's dark when you think about it. His entire purpose now is just to be an obstacle, to be a problem, just to be there causing problems. That's the meaning that he's constructed for his existence and for all of these demons. The demons are rallied, and now they need somewhere to gather. And this is where it starts to get a little interesting because the demons immediately start building. So they're not sitting around in despair, just like being tormented. They're engineers, they're architects, they're craftsmen. They used to be angels, remember? And so they kind of helped create reality. So they know how to work with materials. They end up, it's just picturing this is just really funny as I say it. They start mining hell. They start finding precious metals, gold, silver, and gems. All of this wealth is just buried in the ground. And then, there's this demon Mammon who's leading the mining operation because, of course, he is. And Milton has this aside about how even when Mammon was in heaven, he was always looking down. While the other angels were worshiping and praising, Mammon was always admiring the golden streets. Like I said, he's the god of money and greed. So he was always about wealth and acquisition. So of course, he's the one organizing the mining in hell. And they use these materials to build what they call pandemonium. And this is this massive palace, this temple, this whole Capitol building for hell. And it's described as being architecturally beautiful, having soaring columns and golden roofs and intricate designs. It's truly magnificent. And so it seems to rival anything in heaven. And here's the thing I love about this whole idea. The word pandemonium didn't exist before Milton wrote this. He invented it. It's Greek. Pan, meaning all. Daimon, meaning demon. So it's the place where all of demons gather. And now we use pandemonium to mean chaos or uproar, but Milton literally meant it as this is the demonic parliament or the demons' parliament where they get together. And the fact that they're building this beautiful place, beautiful palace in hell just tells you something about Satan's whole strategy. He can't create new things. Only God can truly create. But Satan can copy and he can mimic, which he can take what he knows of heaven's glory and try to recreate it in hell. So ultimately, anything that Satan could do is just an imitation. It's a mirror. Everything he does is in reference to God, even when he's trying to oppose God. So they build pandemonium, and then the trumpets sound, and then all the demons pour into this massive building. All of these massive angelic forms, and they all fit inside because they can shrink themselves down. They're a spiritual mass that can condense or expand as needed. So you've got this building that's huge by human standards, but that manages to hold literally millions of demons because they're all, I don't know, compressing their forms to fit in it. And once they're all inside, seated on the thrones, Satan calls a council of war to be more specific. They need to decide what they're going to be doing next, how they're going to respond to this defeat. And this is where book 1 ends and book 2 begins, which is, as any good place to talk about what Milton is actually doing here. Notice how Satan's rhetoric has shifted. In the Lake of Fire, he was talking about fighting and about resistance and about how they're not defeated yet. But by the time they're building Pandemonium, he's actually talking about reigning, about having a kingdom, and about establishing power. The mood has changed from rebellion to empire building. And notice how everything he does is a copy of heaven. He sits on a throne, just like God sits on a throne. He gathers a council, just like there's a council in heaven. He builds a palace of gold, like heaven has gold streets. So he's not creating anything new. He's just building a sad, damaged copy of what he used to have. And that ultimately becomes really important as the story goes on. Because Satan's whole thing is that he wants to be equal to God, right? Like he wants to be his own being, independent, free from God's authority. But everything that he does is defined by God. So like he's always reacting to God, always responding to God, always building in reference to God, which is really sad because like he can't even escape that relationship, even though he desperately wants to. But let's get into book 2, where things get really, really interesting, because we're about to have a democratic council meeting in hell where demons vote on what to do next. And honestly, it's more civil than most modern political discourse. So all the demons are gathered in Pandemonium, and Satan is sitting on a throne that's described as outshining the wealth of Persia and India combined, which is excessive, but that's kind of the point. And Satan opens the floor for debate on what they should do next. And I love this scene so much because Milton's doing something really tricky here. He's showing that even hell has a parliamentary procedure. So like the demons debate, they make arguments, they vote. It's like this democratic thing in this like twisted way, which is kind of funny to me because, but you know, Milton's writing this, you know, in the 1660s, like right after the English Republic collapsed. And so he's kind of even showing that demons have a functional democracy while England couldn't even manage it. So there's that. The first speaker is Moloch. And Moloch is exactly who you expect him to be based off of his Old Testament reputation. Cringe. But he's also a warrior, and he's brutal, and he's pretty straightforward. So his proposal is pretty simple. March back to heaven right now and fight. Fight, fight, fight. All out war. Immediate revenge. He doesn't care. He doesn't care if they lose again, and he just wants violence. He's just like, he'd rather be annihilated fighting than sit in hell accepting defeat. And speaking of annihilation, it's actually an interesting concept that comes up a few times in the poem. There's this idea that there's something worse than hell, which is actual death, like true death, where you cease to exist completely. I know some Christians hold to this too. I think it's actually becoming pretty popular. Instead of this idea that there's like eternal conscious torment, eventually you just like die and like cease to exist. But to Milton in this book, apparently only God can do that directly to an angelic being. So it's not something that happens naturally because angels are immortal by default, but God could unmake them if he wanted to. And basically Moloch's, saying, I'd rather risk complete non-existence than sit here, which, is pretty hardcore. But then Belial stands up, and Belial is described as looking really dignified and sounding super eloquent, but being fundamentally lazy and cowardly. So he's all macho, no man. He's all appearance, no meat to him, underneath. Guys, I really got to work on my analogies. But Belial argues against Moloch's plan by pointing out that war is stupid because they already lost once badly. And so if they're going to go back and fight again, God might actually get angry enough to actually destroy them completely instead of just imprisoning them in hell. Because like right now they are in hell, which absolutely sucks. But at least they're still conscious, like they're still themselves. So better to just ride it out, and then maybe eventually God will stop them or like stop being mad at them. Or maybe hell won't seem so bad once they get used to it. Now, it's the most pathetic position possible, And Belial makes it sound completely reasonable, though. That's like his whole thing. He's like the demon. He's the demon of rationalized cowardice, making this terrible weakness sound like wisdom. And then Mammon speaks up with a completely different argument. He's like, look, heaven sucks anyways. You think I want to go back to eternity singing hymns and praising God? That sounds awful. Like, we have freedom here. We can build our own civilization. We can make hell into a rival kingdom that's just as good as heaven. Let's focus on that instead of revenge. And then the crowd actually kind of likes this idea because it gives them purpose without requiring them to face God again. So they can save face by saying that we're building something new instead of admitting that, yeah, we're all just hiding from our defeat. But then Beelzebub stands up and then everyone goes quiet because Beelzebub is Satan's guy. Everyone knows that when Beelzebub speaks, he's speaking for Satan, and ultimately whatever he proposes is what Satan actually wants. And Beelzebub lays out this real plan. He says, and I think this is the first time it's mentioned in the poem, that they've heard rumors that God is creating something new, a new world, a new creature called man. And this new world is going to be outside of hell, outside of heaven, somewhere in between. And this new creature is going to be weaker than angels, but incredibly loved by God. Given special treatment, maybe even destined to replace the fallen angels in God's favor. And so Beelzebub proposes, what if we find this new world? What if we corrupt this new creature? Like, we can't beat God directly. We all saw how that went. But, we can't hurt him by indirectly destroying what he loves most. Or, sorry, not that he can't indirectly hurt him. They definitely can indirectly hurt him. That was my point. Basically, everyone agrees that this is brilliant. So they take a vote, but it's unanimous, of course. They are going to target Earth and humanity. But now they need a volunteer to actually do it. Someone has to leave hell, find Earth, scout it out, and figure out how to corrupt it. And Beelzebub opens the floor. Who is brave enough to take on this dangerous mission? And then there's this awkward silence because nobody wants to volunteer for what sounds like a suicide mission. And then, of course, Satan stands up and volunteers himself. Now, Milton makes it pretty clear that all this, was planned, with the plan from the very beginning, that Satan and Beelzebub probably discussed this before the council even started, and that their whole democratic process was theater to make the army feel included in the decision. But Satan was always going to be the one to go because he doesn't trust anyone else to do it right, and he definitely doesn't want to stay in hell if he can avoid it. Satan gives his heroic speech about how if he's going to be their leader, he needs to act like it. So he takes on the dangerous mission himself, and he can't ask his soldiers to do something that he himself won't do. And it sounds noble with his leadership and sacrifice and taking responsibility, like, you're a good guy, Satan. But the reality is, Satan's doing this out of selfishness. He wants the glory if it succeeds, and he doesn't want to share credit, and he wants to have an excuse for leaving hell. So he's framing his selfishness as selflessness, which is something that he's incredibly good at. So Satan volunteers, and everyone cheers, and then he leaves Pandemonium. And then there's this detail that I love where Milton describes all of the demons filing out the building and resuming to their full size. So you've got like these millions of these massive beings expanding back to mountain scale as they spread across hell, and some of them start exploring their new home, and they find these massive beasts and dragons and serpents down there, and then creatures even more corrupted than the demons themselves. So apparently hell has wildlife, and it's exactly as terrible as you would expect. Meanwhile, Satan's flying off to the edge of hell because apparently hell has borders. It seems to be a prison that has, within walls, and the exit is locked by 9 gates. 3 of them are made of brass, 3 of them are made of iron, and 3 of them are made of diamond, all sealed shut so that nobody can get out. But guarding the gates are 2 figures, and this is where it gets weird in a very uncomfortable way. The first figure is a woman. Well, the top half is a woman with a beautiful face and attractive upper body, but her lower half is this serpentine, scaly thing, and around her waist are these hellhounds, or these devilish dogs that are constantly biting and snarling. They burrow into her body and then emerge again, in and out, causing constant pain. It's disturbing, and I think the idea is supposed to be like this is sin personified. The other figure is harder to describe because it barely has a form. It's described as a shadow or like a darkness or a void in the shape of something vaguely humanoid, kind of like that Expedition 33 guy. When it moves, the ground shakes. It carries a dart, but you can barely see it because the figure itself is so dark. So that that person is death. So Satan approaches ready to fight as if, if he needs to, but then sin recognizes him and then calls him father. And Satan's just like, excuse me, what? And then sin explains, and then this is where Milton gets into some really interesting allegorical territory. She says that she was born or created or conceived, whatever you want to call it, at the exact moment that Satan had the first thought of rebelling against God. The instant that pride and envy entered his heart in heaven, sin sprang into existence, fully formed out of his head. And apparently, she was beautiful when she first appeared, and when the other angels who were considering joining Satan's rebellion were drawn to her, she was attractive to them. She tempted them into sin further, which is pretty on the nose metaphor for how sin works in general. And then, while still in heaven, sin gave birth to death, because sin, when it's fully formed, ultimately brings forth death. So that's straight from the New Testament, James 1, verse 15. It says, desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And death, the moment he was born, R-worded his mother and impregnated her with these hellhounds that now constantly torment her. So death is both sin's son and the father of her ongoing torment through these hell beasts. So it's cycles of violence and a horror that just keep getting worse, which is, again, pretty clearly allegorical for how sin and death work in the world. When Satan and his armies were cast out of heaven, sin and death were also cast out too. And as they fell, God gave sin the keys to hell and told her to guard the gates and never open them. And now that raises an interesting question. Why would God give the keys of hell to sin instead of posting an angel there to guard it? I think the answer is symbolic. Sin is what locks people in hell. Sin is the jailer. That's like the whole point. God doesn't need to actively imprison people because sin imprisons itself. Satan hears this whole bizarre family history and he's like, okay, that's weird and disturbing, but I need you to open the gate. And then sin initially refuses because God told her never to open it. But then Satan offers her a deal. He's just like, look, I'm going to this new earth thing, this new world, earth. And if I succeed, if I corrupt this new creature band, then you and death can come with me. Like, you can leave hell. You can go to earth and make it your kingdom. Death can rule over mortality, and sin can rule over the fallen. Like, you'll be free. And of course, sin and death immediately agree because they've been locked in hell for this whole time and they desperately want out. So sin opens the gates, and beyond the gates is nothing. Well, not nothing exactly. It's chaos, but with a capital C. Milton describes it as this primordial void of unformed matter, the raw stuff of creation before God shaped it into anything. So it's not just empty space. It's elements that aren't elements yet. This potential, the best example I could use is potential energy versus like kinetic energy, if you can think back to sixth grade science class. But anyways, things are constantly colliding, reforming, breaking apart. So Satan has to cross through this to get to Earth. So he leaps out into chaos and immediately starts falling because there's no up or down in chaos, and there's also no physics. So he's trying to fly, but his wings don't work, right? Because there's nothing to push against. And then random winds blow him in different directions, and he's getting battered around, and he's tumbling through this void, basically making zero progress. Finally, he finds a massive figure made of darkness floating in the chaos. And Satan asks him for directions because even Satan needs to stop and ask for directions sometimes. The figure identifies itself as chaos. Not the place, but rather the personification of it, the being who rules over disorder. And Satan offers chaos a deal too, saying, well, hey, if I succeed on earth and bring ruin to God's creation, then the world will eventually fall into disorder and then return to you. And I'm basically helping you reclaim territory that God took from you when he created the universe. And chaos is just like, yeah, sure, Earth's that way. And, just go. So Satan keeps struggling through the void, getting blown around by random chance, until finally, after what seems like forever, he sees a light in the distance, a pinpoint of order in all the midst of chaos. And that light ultimately is the universe. Earth and the stars and everything hanging in the void like a lamp in the darkness. And Satan swims, flies, crawls, and pulls himself through the chaos until he reaches the outer shell of creation. And then there's this beautiful image of him climbing up onto the solid ground of the universe's edge and just collapsing for a moment because he's just so exhausted from the journey. But eventually, he made it. He found Earth at last, or at least the general neighborhood of it. And ultimately, that's where book 2 ends. Satan successfully escaped hell, and he's about to enter God's new creation. But before he does, Milton cuts away from hell entirely and shows us what is happening in heaven while all of this has been going on. Because if we're going to understand the fall, we need to understand God's perspective on it. And that is where book 3 comes in. All right, so book 3 opens up with Milton doing something interesting where he steps out of the narrative for a moment and addresses the muse directly. And remember, for Milton, the muse isn't some Greek goddess. It's the Holy Spirit. He's praying, he's asking for divine inspiration to tell this part of the story right, and he talks about his blindness, which is one of the few moments where Milton directly references his own life in the poem. It's so interesting. He talks about how he lives in darkness, how he'll never be able to see the sunlight again, never see his wife's face, never see the beauty of nature or read a book like with his own 2 eyes. But he asks that even though his physical eyes are dark, his inner vision might be enlightened so that he can see the truth clearly even without sight. Then he just immediately pivots to heaven, and we're about to see God himself as a character in this poem, which is wild when you really think about it. Milton writing dialogue for God, which is a bold choice to say the least. Yeah. The scene opens up in heaven. And heaven is described as pure light, not like sunlight or firelight, but this impossible, clear, radiant light that doesn't cast shadows. So it's light without the darkness, which literally shouldn't be possible physically, but that's kind of the point. And at the center of heaven is God's throne. And seated there is God the Father with the Son at his right hand. And we need to pause here for a second because this gets into some theologically complicated territory that's really important for understanding the rest of the story. So in Orthodox Christian theology, like the standard Christian theology, there's this concept of called the Trinity. There's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who are 3 distinct persons who are also somehow also one God, one being. And the traditional understanding is that all 3 persons of the Trinity are co-eternal, meaning they've always existed together. So like there was never a time when the Father existed without the Son, and vice versa. They're equally divine, equally eternal, and the Son didn't begin at some point because he exists outside of time along with the Father. So that's the standard Orthodox position that most Christian, traditions hold to. Outside of that view is, heresy. But Milton in this poem seems to take a slightly different view. And this is where it becomes really important for understanding Satan's rebellion. In Paradise Lost, Milton presents the Son as having a beginning point, where there was a moment when the Father declared the Son and elevated him to divine status and authority. So the Son exists before creation of the world, obviously. Colossians says that he was the creator, but he's also being presented as having been begotten at a specific moment in heaven's history, rather than being co-eternal with the Father. Now, that might seem like a minor theological detail, but it's actually crucial to the story because it gives Satan a specific moment to rebel against. In Milton's version, Satan was the highest angel until the Father declared the Son and said, "From now on, everyone bows to him as you bow to me." And Satan's response was basically like, well, I was the chief angel. I was the most powerful being created. And now suddenly there's this Son who gets elevated above me. I should have that position and not him. That jealousy and wounded pride is what sparks the entire rebellion. But regardless of the theological specifics, the key thing is that the Son is presented as being one with the Father in purpose and in nature. So when the Son speaks, it's essentially God speaking. So they're in perfect unity, which is why the poem can have them have conversations. It's not like they're 2 separate beings disagreeing. They're more like 2 aspects of the same divine will. That makes sense. So God and the Son are sitting on the thrones looking down at earth. And they can see everything because that's the whole omniscient thing. Like they can see Satan crawling through chaos to the universe. I can just imagine them just looking down and just like seeing this guy that they locked in here, Satan, just like he's like a little pixel across the screen. You can just see him like slowly going towards Earth. And then they like zoom in on him and he's just like crawling in like a cave somewhere. My own imagination's getting the best of me, but they can see Adam and Eve in the garden, happy and innocent and completely unaware of what's coming. They can see the future, the past, everything all at once happening simultaneously. God turns to the Son and essentially says, "So, Satan's about to reach Earth and corrupt humanity. Are you seeing this?" And the Son's like, "Yep, I'm seeing it." And God says, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is kind of like the gist, "I'm not going to stop him. I could stop him right now with a thought, but I'm not going to because humanity has to have free will. Like, that's the whole point of creating them. They have to be able to choose between good or evil, or else their love and obedience essentially mean nothing. And of course, that's crucial to Milton's theodicy, which is like a fancy way of saying his defense of God's justice. The whole poem is or subtitled a theodicy, meaning it's trying to answer the question, if God is all powerful and all good, why does evil exist? Why does suffering happen? And Milton's answer is free will. Love and virtue are only meaningful if they're freely chosen. So a forced paradise where nobody can choose evil isn't really a paradise. It's either a prison or a zoo. Real love requires the freedom to choose not to love. So God's saying, I gave humanity free will. I gave them one simple rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I gave them every reason to follow that rule. I gave them paradise. I gave them each other. I gave them direct relationship with me. I gave them cute little animals like the quokka. But Satan's going to tempt them, and they are going to have to choose. And I already know what they're going to choose, and they're going to choose wrong because I exist outside of time and I can see the future. And then God says something that sounds harsh at first. He says they're going to fall because of their own choice. They were warned, they were given everything, but they're going to choose to disobey. And because they choose it freely, they're going to be punished. But then, and this is where it gets really interesting, God also says that they're not going to be punished as severely as Satan was. Satan was an angel who knew me directly, who saw the divine glory firsthand and still rebelled. But humans are different. They're weaker. They're going to be tempted by an enemy that they can't even see coming. Like, they don't fully understand what they're doing. So while they'll face consequences for their choice, absolutely, they'll also be offered mercy in a way that Satan won't be. And the son asks, well, how? How can they be offered mercy if justice demands punishment for disobedience? And so God says, well, someone has to pay the debt. Sin requires death. That's the law I created, of the universe, because disobedience severs the connection to divine life. So if humans are going to be saved, someone has to die in their place. Someone has to pay their debt. And is there anyone who would volunteer to do that? And, there's some moment of silence in heaven. And then all the angels are there listening to this conversation, by the way, and no one says a darn thing. Because what God's asking for is insane. He's asking for someone to become mortal, to become human, to live a finite life, and then die, possibly forever, to save creatures who brought damnation on themselves through their own stupid choice. And then the son speaks, and he's just like, I'll do it. Just like that. No hesitation, no negotiation. He volunteers to become human, to live life among them, to die for them, and to defeat death itself in the process so that humanity can be redeemed. And God accepts this sacrifice. God says that one day, not yet, but eventually, the Son will descend to earth. He'll be born as a human baby. He'll live a perfect life showing humanity what they were always meant to be, and then the humans will kill him. But through his death, the debt will be paid, and through his resurrection, death will be defeated. And humanity will have a way back to paradise. And all the angels in heaven start singing like a full-on divine choir because they have millions of voices, because what they've just witnessed is the most profound act of love in the history of all creation. God himself volunteering to die for creatures who don't deserve it and don't even know that they need it yet. Now, Milton, it's kind of like a funny name, Milton. He's doing something really clever here by showing us God's plan for redemption before showing us the fall itself. We need to know how the story ends before we see how it begins. And that changes how we read everything that comes next. So when Adam and Eve fall, we're not despairing because we already know that there's a plan for salvation. The tragedy is real, of course, but it's not the final say. The fall isn't the end of the story. It's not even like the middle. It's the beginning of a much longer story about redemption. And this is also Milton's answer to the question that hangs over the whole poem. How can God allow the fall to happen if he loves humanity? And his answer is because God already has a plan to fix it. The fall is permitted because the redemption plan is already prepared. God's not caught off guard by human sin. He's been planning the solution since before time began. But we're getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves because While this is happening in heaven, Satan's reaching the outer edge of the universe, and he's about to enter God's creation for the first time. Milton describes Satan landing on the hard outer shell of the universe, this crystalline sphere that contains all of creation. And he's looking for a way in, walking around the outside, trying to find a door or crack or something. And then he sees this bright light, which I talked about earlier, which turns out to be the sun, and the sun is where the angel Uriel lives. So Satan flies to the sun, and here's where Satan does something really clever. He transforms himself, shrinking down from this massive corrupted angelic form and disguising himself as a cherub. Now, of course, when you hear cherub, you probably think of, well, actually, if you're a viewer of my channel, you know that cherubs are not these cute little Renaissance babies, but because that's clearly not what the Bible describes. Biblical cherubim are these intense creatures with multiple faces, and wings covered in eyes. But Milton is going with the Renaissance interpretation here, where cherubs are these, unfortunately, cute little baby angels. So Satan disguises himself as a cute little cherub, and then he approaches Uriel, who's one of these 7 archangels, the angel of the sun, sometimes called the light of God. But Uriel has never encountered deceit before because nobody in heaven has. The concept doesn't exist there. Angels are truthful by nature, and lying isn't something that they do. So when Satan, disguised as a cherub, approaches Uriel and says, "Hey, I'm trying to find this new creation called Earth because I want to see God's work and praise him for it," Uriel just believes him. Like, why wouldn't he? Like, the idea that an angel would even lie doesn't even cross his mind. So Uriel tells Satan exactly where Earth is. He points to it in the distance and says, "That's the one. Beautiful, isn't it? God just made it, and the first humans are in the garden there." And then Satan thanks him, then he flies off toward Earth, and then that's where book 3 ends. Satan's about to reach the Garden of Eden. He's about to see Adam and Eve for the first time, and everything's about to go wrong. But before we get to the fall, Milton gives us this beautiful sequence where we see the Garden of Eden in its perfect state, where we see Adam and Eve as they were meant to be, happy, innocent, in love, in harmony with creation. And we get to spend time with them before everything breaks, because the tragedy of the fall only works if we understand what is exactly being lost. You have to see the beauty before you can mourn its destruction. That's pretty poetic. So Satan's flying toward Earth, and Milton pauses the action for a moment to get inside Satan's head in what is honestly one of the most important passages in the entire poem, because it's where we see Satan's mask slip and the facade start to crack. He lands on Mount Nephates, which Milton identifies as the mountain at the edge of Eden, and he just completely breaks down. He starts talking to himself, and it's not the confident, defiant Satan that we saw in hell giving speeches to his army. This is someone who is drowning in regret and self-hatred and confusion about what exactly he's become. He looks at the sun, which reminds him of heaven's light, and he's overcome with nostalgia. And then he's overcome with anger at himself for feeling nostalgic, and then he starts thinking about whether or not he should turn back, whether or not he should ask for forgiveness. And then he goes through this whole, the reasoning. He's like, I could go back. God would forgive me. He's merciful. That's kind of like his whole thing. If I just humbled myself and asked for forgiveness, I could return to heaven. I could have my old position back. Well, not the same position, obviously, but, I'd be demoted, but I'd be in heaven again instead of being miserable all the time. And then, of course, he catches himself. And then he says, no, I can't do that. Because even if I asked for forgiveness, even if God forgave me, I'd still be the same person inside. And I'm a naughty boy. I'm a bad boy. I'd still want what I wanted before. I'd be bowing and praising on the outside, but inside I'd still be resenting it, and I'd still be jealous of the sun, and I'd still want equality with God, and eventually I'd rebel again. So what's the point of even asking for forgiveness if I'm not even going to actually change? It would just be delaying the inevitable. Probably. And this is the tragedy of Satan right here in this one little moment. He is self-aware enough to know that he's broken. At least he can do that. He's smart enough to understand what's wrong with him, but he's not willing to change. He knows forgiveness is possible, but he won't take it because it would require humility. And as we know, this gentleman he's not the most humble guy. And he'd rather suffer forever than humble himself, which is the opposite of the whole Christian idea. And then Satan says the line that's maybe the most important in the entire poem, Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell. Hell isn't just a place, it's a state of being. It's like internal. Satan brings hell with him wherever he goes because hell is the condition of the soul, the state of the heart. He thought that escaping the physical location of hell would make him feel better, but now he's standing in the most beautiful place in creation and he still feels tormented because the torture is not external. It's what he's become. That's why the better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven line from earlier is so tragic when you think about it. He doesn't get it yet. There's no reigning. There's no reigning in hell. There's just hell. It doesn't matter if he's sitting on a throne in pandemonium or crawling through chaos or standing in paradise. He's in hell either way because he is hell. But then Satan makes his choice. He decides that since he can't be happy, no one else gets to be happy either. And if he has to suffer, then he's going to drag everyone down with him. And Milton says that his face twists. To quote specifically, on his brow sat horror. And he transforms himself into this mask of hate and determination, and he flies down to the Garden of Eden. Now, here, Milton spends a bunch of lines describing the Garden of Eden, and it is genuinely beautiful poetry. Highly recommend you go read it. The garden is described as being on top of a mountain that's like layered like steps. So there are these graduated plateaus rising up. Like a terrace farming in the Inca civilization or Mayans, whatever one's on the mountain. I don't know. And at the very top is the garden itself. And it's surrounded by this thick wall of vegetation that's impenetrable. And the only entrance is through the gate on the eastern side. Satan doesn't bother with the gate. He just leaps over the wall like a wolf jumping into a sheep pen. And then Milton specifically uses that imagery. Satan's like a wolf or a thief breaking into a protected space, violating the boundaries. Once he's inside, Satan's hit with the beauty of it. The beauty. It's described in these lush sensory terms. The smell of flowers, the sound of water, the sight of trees heavy with fruit, mangoes. Everything's living in perfect harmony. It's paradise. It's what earth was meant to be before everything went wrong. And Satan sees all these animals lying together, like the lion lying down next to the lambs, bears and the deer together, predator and prey in perfect harmony because death doesn't exist yet. Violence isn't even a concept. Everything lives in mutual love and peace. And then Satan sees two figures walking through the garden, and he immediately knows these must be human beings because they're different from the animals. They walk upright. They have a bearing and dignity that animals don't. And more importantly, they're made in the image of God. Satan recognizes that divine fingerprint on them. Milton describes Adam and Eve as Eve's beautiful and gentle and made for Adam, and then Adam is strong and rational and leads her, you know. But the key thing is they're being described as being equals in dignity and in worth, just with different traits. And they're also nude. They're naked. But Milton emphasizes over and over again that this isn't sexual or lustful because those concepts don't even exist yet. So like I said, like they have the pre-fall innocence. Actually, I shouldn't have said like I said because I didn't say that. I'm saying that right now. They're innocent. And Satan watches them as he's overcome with something more complex than a simple envy, if you will. He's envious of their innocence, their happiness, their ability to love without complication. But he's also struck by genuine admiration. He sees them and he thinks that they're beautiful. He almost loves them in this moment. And this is where Milton does something brilliant here. He shows us that Satan isn't necessarily incapable of recognizing goodness and beauty, that he's not blind to it, that he sees how perfect they are and how much they love each other and how happy they are. And he could choose to protect that. Like he could choose to just like leave them alone and, you know, just appreciate the beauty from a distance, maybe even find some peace in witnessing their joy. But instead, he chooses to destroy it. Not because he doesn't understand what he's destroying, but because he does. He sees the beauty clearly, and he decides to corrupt it anyways. That makes it worse. So that's not out of ignorance, it's like spite. It's like deliberate malice. Shortly after, Satan moves closer, and then he hides in the bushes like the little rat he is, and he listens to Adam and Eve talking. They're sitting by a fountain eating fruit, just chatting about, how beautiful the garden is and how grateful they are to God and, for this and for that and smash burgers, candles, raspberries, highlighters. And then they start talking about how they've been given only one rule. And this is the first time we actually hear what the rule is in the poem. God told them that they can eat from any tree in the garden except one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That tree is off limits, and if they eat of it, they will surely die. Now, Adam and Eve don't know what die means because death doesn't exist yet. They've never seen anything die. The concept is completely foreign to them. So it's this abstract threat. God pretty much says, don't do this or you'll die. And they're like, okay, we don't know what that means, but God seems pretty serious about it, so we're probably not going to do it. And then Eve asks Adam, like, what do you think die means? And Adam says, I don't know, but God said it's bad, and so let's just not eat from that tree. We literally have every other tree in existence to eat from, so it's not exactly hardship to avoid eating from one tree, Eve. And then, they both agree, and then they keep their fruit eating and, be merry and, in love. And Satan's listening to all this, and he realizes, that's my angle. That's how I'm going to get to you. Through the tree, through that one prohibition. But he can't approach them as he can't approach them as himself because they'd recognize him, of course. So he's going to do the same thing that he did with Uriel. They might not know what deceit is, but they know what evil looks like. So when they see it, they're going to know. So he needs a disguise. He needs to take the form of something innocent and trustworthy. And in Satan, in all of his wisdom, decides on transitioning, a modern term, I guess, into a serpent. Because serpents in the garden before the fall are actually beautiful creatures. They're not scary or threatening yet. That comes later as a part of the curse. Right now, serpents are these elegant, graceful animals. They're subtle, and that's what Satan needs, subtlety. But before Satan can enact his plan, he gets caught. As you see, while Satan's been sneaking around the garden, Mr. Uriel from before has been watching from the sun. And he saw this cherub approach the garden, and then he saw the cherub's face twist into expressions of hate and rage and despair. And Uriel's like, wait a second, cherubs don't make faces like that. I've been tricked. So Uriel flies down to the garden and then finds Gabriel, who's the chief angel in charge of guarding Eden. He's the guardian of Eden. And Uriel says, Gabriel, hey, one of those fallen angels is in the garden, is disguised as something, and I don't know what, but he's in there. So then Gabriel sends out a search party, and then angels start sweeping through the garden looking for an intruder. And then they find Satan in his true form crouched next to Adam and Eve while they're sleeping. And he's whispering into Eve's ear, trying to plant dreams, trying to corrupt her while she sleeps. The angels eventually grab him, and then there's this great moment where one of them touches Satan with a spear, and the touch breaks his disguise. He immediately reverts into his true massive form, this terrifying angelic being suddenly manifesting in the middle of the garden, dwarfing the angels who found him. They bring Satan to Gabriel, and Gabriel's just like, what are you doing here? And Satan gives this whole song of, and dance about how hell is really uncomfortable, and he just needed a break, and he was just wandering around, and then he happened to end up here. It was a total coincidence, and he's definitely not planning anything. Gabriel doesn't buy it for a second. He calls Satan out by saying, oh, so you're the only one who left hell, huh? You abandoned your entire army down there suffering while you came here for vacation? Some leader you are. Or are you going to claim that you're not strong enough to endure what they endure? Are you weaker than them? And Satan's pride, of course, flares up because he can't stand being called weak. He starts growing, getting bigger, ready to fight. Gabriel and the other angels grow too, matching his size, and they're about to have this massive battle that could easily destroy the garden and maybe the earth itself. But then God intervenes by causing these golden scales to appear in the sky. Literal scales, like a balance for like weighing things, not like scales because he's a snake. And on one side is Satan's pride and power, and then this is kind of funny. On the other side is God's will. And the scales are completely unbalanced. Satan's side is basically like nothing compared to God's. And then Gabriel just points at the sky and says, yeah, look at that chart. You can't win this fight. You couldn't win in heaven, and you definitely can't win here. You're fighting against omnipotence. And like the math just is not working in your favor. Satan sees the scales and realizes, all right, Gabriel, you're right. So he's not going to win this fight. There's no point of even trying. So he leaves. He flies away into the night. but not before glaring back at the garden with pure, utter, absolute, unapologetic hatred, already planning his next move. And that is the end of book 4. Satan's been temporarily thwarted, but he's not giving up. He's already planning how to come back, and the angels know that he'll be back. They just don't know when or how. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve wake up next morning, and Eve tells Adam that she had a weird dream. She dreamed that someone took her to the tree of knowledge of good and evil and convinced her to eat from it. And that in the dream she ate, she felt like she was becoming godlike. And then she flew up into the air before falling back down and waking up. Adam is concerned about this dream. He's like, that's disturbing, but dreams aren't real. Like, just because you dream something doesn't mean you'd actually do it or that you even want to do it. And Eve is comforted by that, and then they go about their day. But God, watching from heaven, knows that Satan's going to try again, and that Eve's dream was just the first attack. So God sends an angel down to warn them, to make sure that they understand what's at stake and what is coming. And that angel is Raphael. And that's where book 5 through 8 comes in, which are basically one long flashback where Raphael tells Adam and Eve the entire history of Satan's rebellion and the creation of the world. And we need to cover those because it is crucial to understanding what happens next and why the fall is so devastating when it finally comes. And I'll cover all of them in one section just to make it easy. All right, so Raphael arrives in the garden, and he's described in his true angelic form. He's got 6 wings. He's got 2 covering his face, 2 covering his feet, and then 2 for flying. This is the biblical description of a seraphim straight from Isaiah chapter 6. And he's glowing with a divine light, so Adam and Eve see him coming from a distance like a second sun, pretty much. And Adam's immediate reaction is to prepare a feast, because that's when you do when angels visit, especially pre-fall. You show hospitality. So Adam and Eve gather the best fruits and arrange them beautifully, and they welcome Raphael to their home. Raphael sits with them and eats, and Eve's kind of amazed that angels can even eat physical food. And Raphael explains that everything in creation is part of a spectrum of being. You've got plants, which have physical form, and then you have animals, which have physical form plus instinct and limited consciousness. Then you have humans, which have physical form plus consciousness plus immortal souls. And then you have angels, which have all of that plus divine power and existence outside of time. And then God, who's, put all that omnipotence and omniscience and ability to create ex nihilo. He just, he's just the most powerful. It's all connected. It's all one creation on a continuum, pretty much. This is important theologically because it establishes that there's one continuity between the physical realm and the spiritual realms. They're not separate. They're all, one unified creation. So yes, angels can eat human food because the physical is just a lower expression of the spiritual. So they eat together, and then Raphael gets to the point of his visit. He says, God sent me here to warn you. There's an enemy who wants to destroy you. He's already attacked you once. That dream that you have, Eve, by the way, wasn't just a dream. That was him, and he'll attack again. But the way he'll attack is through deception. He'll make disobedience seem reasonable. He'll make sin seem attractive, and he'll twist your reasoning so you need to be on your guard. And then Adam's like, wait, who's this enemy? Like, why does he hate us? We haven't even done anything to him. Like, we just got here. And then Raphael says, that's a long story. But if you want to understand why he hates you and what you're up against, I need to tell you about what happened before you were created. And Adam's like, yes, please tell us everything. So Raphael begins, and this is where we get the backstory of Satan's fall chronologically instead of in flashbacks. And we finally get to understand what actually happened in heaven. Raphael says that before earth, before humans, human time as we understand it, there was just heaven. And in heaven, there were angels, millions of them, maybe an infinite number, organized in hierarchies and orders and in ranks. And the greatest of all these angels was the one who would later become Satan. He's never named in the poem, interestingly enough. Even in the flashbacks, he's just called the adversary or the enemy. His angelic name has been completely erased. And one day, God made an announcement. He gathered all of the angels together and said, I'm declaring my son. This is my son, equal to me in all things. And from this day forward, he will rule at my right hand. All of you will bow to him as you bow to me. And all the angels celebrated with trumpets and singing and joy, except one, Satan. Well, He wasn't Satan yet. He was still this chief angel. Oh, but he was furious. He'd been the highest of all created beings, the most powerful, the most glorious. And now suddenly there's this son who's equal to God. Like, where did he come from? Why does he get to be elevated above everyone? Satan's pride ultimately couldn't handle it. He felt like he had been demoted, like he'd lost his status. And he's starting to think, started thinking, why should I bow to anyone? I'm powerful enough to rule myself. I don't need to serve. So that night, Satan goes to his second in command, Beelzebub, and says, we got to talk. Gather the angels under our command and meet me at the northern edge of the heaven. Tell them I have an announcement. So then Beelzebub naturally spreads the word, and then a third of heaven's angels fly north to meet Satan. And then when they get there, Satan's built himself a throne made of gold and diamonds, and then he's sitting on it, addressing the crowd. And he's giving this speech about freedom and self-determination. He says stuff like, why should we serve anyone? We're powerful beings with our own strength and glory. Like this idea that we need to bow and serve someone else, like that's oppressive, that's tyranny. We should be free to rule ourselves, which is ironic because don't they all just do that to him after they rebel? But most of the angels are nodding along because it sounds good, right? Like freedom, self-determination, equality. These are attractive ideas that appeal to something or something deep in created beings. But one angel speaks up. His name is Abdiel, not Abdul, Abdiel. And he's a low-ranking angel, not important or, powerful. But he stands up and he's just like, wait, this doesn't make sense. You're talking about freedom from God? Like God created us. Everything we have, our power, our consciousness, our existence itself, it all comes from him. We're not self-created. We're not independent. Freedom from God isn't freedom. It's just ceasing to exist. Like we wouldn't be anything without him. And of course, Satan is just like, he doesn't have a good answer to this because ultimately he knows that Abdiel's right. So Satan starts to pivot his clever radical move like a politician. He says, Abdiel, do you remember being created? Does anyone here remember the moment that they came into being? And of course nobody does because angels were created fully formed. They don't have childhoods or development or memories of growing up. They just suddenly exist one day, fully conscious and mature. Even if they did grow up, like I don't remember the day I was born, so I can't imagine they would either. Well, maybe they are more powerful than I am. Anyways, so Satan says, well, if none of us remember being created, maybe we weren't created. Maybe we've always existed. Maybe we're self-originated. And if that's true, then we don't owe God nothing. And so now this is obviously insane logic that falls apart if you think about it for literally like 2 seconds. But it's also clever because it fills in a gap in knowledge with a convenient lie. The angels don't remember being created, so Satan can plant doubt about whether it even happened. And Abdiel's not buying it. He's just like, dude, like this is blasphemy. Like you're lying to yourself and everyone here, and I'm not going to be a part of it. And then he flies away. Abdiel flies away and goes back to God's throne to report what's happening. Satan lets him go, and then he turns to the remaining angels and is just like, all right, here's the plan. We're going to march to God's throne and take it by force. And we're going to overthrow him and establish our own kingdom where we rule ourselves. And the angels cheer, and Satan's army starts preparing for war. Meanwhile, Abdiel reaches God's throne and warns God about what's happening. And God already, obviously he's omniscient. He can see the future. But he commends Abdiel for his faithfulness anyways. He says, you're the only one who resisted when everyone else was falling for Satan's lies. Good job, lad. And then God calls, for Michael, the chief of heaven's loyal angels, and then Gabriel, his second in command. And then God tells them to gather the armies of heaven and prepare to face Satan's forces. So now we've got 2 armies forming. Satan's rebel angels in the north, and then Michael's loyal angels in the south. And they're about to fight the first war in the history of creation. Raphael, when telling the story to Adam and Eve, pauses here to explain something to Adam. He says, I'm going to describe this battle for you, but you need to understand, angels are not like humans. We don't have physical bodies that can be destroyed permanently. We can take physical form, but our essence is spiritual. So when I describe angels being wounded or defeated, it's not like death the way that you would understand it. Angels can't die unless God unmakes them completely through annihilation. What I'm describing is more like temporary defeat or overpowering, but they almost heal instantly. So that's kind of weird, but the battle begins. The two armies clash, and then they meet in this vast plain in heaven, and it's described in epic terms. Millions of angels on each side, all in their true forms, which are just, massive and glorious and ultimately terrifying. And Abdiel, this little low-ranking angel who spoke up against Satan, he's at the front of Michael's army. And he charges straight at Satan and punches him in the face so hard that Satan stumbles backward like 10 steps. And Abdiel, he says something like, "That's for lying to everyone," which is pretty great. And then the armies clash, and it's described as complete chaos. There's, elements colliding and angelic powers being unleashed. The ground of heaven itself is shaking from the impact of everything. And, these are cosmic beings fighting with cosmic power. Like, I wonder just if there's like fireballs being thrown or something, or like an angel trebuchet. But then, there are one-on-one duels happening throughout the battlefield. Michael is fighting Satan. Gabriel is fighting other rebel leaders. And the descriptions are pretty intense. When Michael and Satan fight, Milton describes it as two planets colliding. Like, that's the scale of power that we're talking about. But here's the thing. No one's winning. Because angels are on both sides are equally powerful. So, like, they'll fight. One will overpower the other, and then the defeated one will heal within minutes, and then they'll just fight again. So it's this complete rigmarole, stalemate, if you will. And this goes on for an entire day. And then night falls because heaven apparently has a day and night system. And both armies retreat to rest. Satan's forces go back to the north, and they're regrouping. And one of Satan's lieutenants, a demon named Nishrach, says, "We need a new strategy. We can't beat them in hand-to-hand combat because we're evenly matched. We need something that's going to give us an advantage." So Satan and his engineers come up with a plan. They start digging into the ground of heaven, and they find raw materials, metals, and minerals. And they use these to invent weapons. Specifically, you could tell what era of history Milton wrote this. Cannons. They create gunpowder and build these massive cannons that can fire projectiles at the enemy. And this is based on a reference in the book of Enoch, which is a non-canonical text that says that when fallen angels taught humanity how to make weapons, in black powder. So Milton's saying that maybe that they learned it in heaven first. So anyways, the next day happens and the battle resumes, and then Satan's forces roll out these freaking cannons. That's just like, of all things to roll out. Like, I bet you if someone wrote this in the 20th century or the 21st century, it would be freaking like tanks or something. And Michael's angels have no idea what they're looking at because they've never seen these weapons before. This entire concept of technology designed specifically to hurt other people is brand new. Satan's forces fire the cannons, and then the loyal angels get hit with this barrage of projectiles, and they're blown backward, knocked over, buried under rubble, and it's utter chaos. And then Satan and his demons are mocking them, making jokes about how the loyal angels are being entertained by their artillery. I promise, I'm not making this up. It's like this is what it says. But then Michael and the stronger angels get angry, and then they decide if Satan's going to use weapons, they'll use weapons too. But they don't build cannons; they just pick up mountains. They literally just pick up mountains. They rip mountains out of the ground of heaven and then throw them at Satan's army, burying the cannons underneath the rocks and earth. So now both armies are just throwing mountains at each other like a food fight. And heaven itself, heaven itself is being torn apart by this conflict. The landscape is being destroyed. It's complete devastation. And then this goes on for another full day. And then again, it's a stalemate. No one's winning. They're just destroying everything around them. And then on the third day, the Son, Jesus, enters the battle. And then up until now, Jesus has been watching from God's throne, but now he decides it's time to end this. And then the son gets in the chariot, this war chariot made of, fire and light and power. And then he drives into the battlefield alone, and just him in this chariot. And then Michael immediately orders all of the loyal angels to fall back, because when the son fights, you don't want to be anywhere near the blast radius. So Jesus rides towards Satan's army, and the description here is also incredible. He's wielding thunderbolts. His presence causes the ground to quake, and rebel angels are being blown backward just from his approach. Yet he's not even fighting yet. He's just moving toward them, and then the rebel angels are just scattering in terror. So Satan sees the son coming, and he realizes that he can't fight this. He's like, this guy's too strong. Jesus is divine. He's not an angel. He's literally God himself incarnate in war form. There's no winning this fight. There's no strategy that works here. Which, how did you not see this coming, you dumb baboon, Satan? So Satan, rather than face Jesus directly, does something rather interesting. He turns and he just jumps. He just leaps off of the edge of heaven voluntarily, just parkours off the edge, and all of his followers jump with him because they'd rather throw themselves into the abyss than face divine judgment. And they fall. For 9 days, they fall through space, through darkness, through chaos, until they land in the lake of fire in hell. And that's where the poem actually begins, with them lying in that fire, stunned and defeated, trying to process what the heck happened. So Raphael finishes telling the story to Adam and Eve and says, so that's who your enemy is. He's the fallen angel who rebelled against God out of pride and jealousy, and spoiler alert, he lost. And now he wants to drag you down with him out of spite, because if he can't have paradise, then ain't nobody can have paradise. And so Adam is processing all of this. And then he's just like, okay, but why are we here? Like, why did God create us? Raphael goes on to explain, after the rebel angels were cast out, there was this empty space in heaven where they used to be. A third of the angels were gone. And then God decided to create a new order of beings, not to necessarily replace the angels, but to add something new to creation. Beings who were a mix of physical and spiritual, who had free will like the angels, but also experienced time and growth and learning. So that's you. You're God's new project, his new joy. So then Raphael tells Adam about the creation of the world, and then this is ultimately books 7 and 8, which are basically Milton's poetic version of Genesis 1. God speaks and creates light out of darkness, of course, and then he separates the firmament, and then he creates the earth and the seas, and then he creates the plants, and then there's the sun, and then there's the moon, then there's the stars, the sea creatures, the birds, and then the land animals, and then finally humans. And so Adam's just kind of sitting there, or standing there. I don't know. Text doesn't say. And he listens to all of this and then just tells Raphael his own story, what he remembers from the first moments of his consciousness. And then Adam tells him that he remembers waking up under a tree with no idea who he was or where he was or what anything was. All of a sudden, he was just conscious. He saw the world around him, and then he felt joy, and then he heard a voice, which was ultimately God's voice, telling him that this garden was his home, that he had dominion over all the animals, that he could eat from any tree except one, that one of the trees was forbidden. Adam says he was fine with this at first. He spent the first time naming all the animals, exploring the garden, enjoying creation. But after a while, he started to feel lonely. He saw all the animals in pairs, and then he was like the only one of his kind. So he asked God, he's just like, well, why am I alone? And God said, you're not alone. I'm with you. And Adam said, and I love this because it ultimately shows like Adam like pushing back against God in like some kind of like healthy way, which is also strange. But he says, with all due respect, sir, I know you're with me, but you're infinite and perfect. I can't relate to you as an equal. I need someone like me, someone like I can talk to and share experiences with on my level. And God basically said, I was hoping you'd say that because this was part of the plan all along. Then, of course, God put Adam into a deep sleep, and then he took one of his ribs, and then he formed Eve from it. And then Adam says that when he woke up and he saw Eve, it was like his whole existence suddenly made sense. She was perfect. She was she completed him. He felt fully alive for the first time in his life. And then Raphael listens to this and he's happy for Adam, but he also gives him a warning. And it's pretty crucial. He says, love her, absolutely. Cherish her, be devoted to her, but don't love her more than you love God. Don't let your love for her override your obedience to God, because free will means that you can choose her over God, and that would be a mistake. And then Adam's like, no, of course not. I love God first. Eve is my partner, but God is my creator. And Raphael is just like, good, remember that when the time comes. Then Raphael leaves and then flies back to heaven. And then Adam and Eve are left with this knowledge and warning. They know that there's an enemy. They know that he's dangerous. And then they know that they need to be careful. And that's where we are when book 9 begins, which is the big one. Because book 9 is where everything falls apart, where paradise is officially lost, and where the tragedy that's been building for 8 books finally happens. All right, so Milton begins book 9 with a somber introduction where he addresses the reader directly. And he basically says, I wish I could stay in the garden forever. I wish I could keep describing paradise and happiness and love, but that's not the story that I have to tell. The story is about the fall, and I have to tell it even though it hurts. And there's this weight to it, the sense of dread, because he knows what comes next is tragedy. And he's building up to this moment for 8 books now. All the setup, all the warnings, all the foreshadowing, it's all been leading here to this one terrible choice. So, we're back in the garden. It's been 8 days since Raphael's visit. Everything seems normal, and Adam and Eve are going about their daily routine, tending to the garden, enjoying one another's company, completely unaware that today is the day that everything would change. Because Satan's back. He's been circling the earth for 7 days, waiting for the right moment, planning his approach, and on the 8th night, he sneaks back into the garden under cover of darkness, and this time, he doesn't come in an angelic form or as a cherub. He enters as a mist, formless, invisible, and he searches for an animal to inhabit. He chooses a serpent. Not because serpents are evil, remember, but at this point, serpents are just beautiful creatures. Like I said, they're elegant and graceful. They're described as, being one of the most lovely animals in the garden. Satan chooses the serpent because it's subtle, graceful, and because it can get close to Eve without seeming threatening. So Satan possesses the serpent and then waits until morning. And then meanwhile, Adam and Eve wake up and then they start discussing their tasks for the day. The garden is massive and it's growing faster than ever that they can tend to it. So Eve suggests that they split up and to be more efficient. She'll work on one section, and then Adam will work on another, and then they'll cover more ground that way. And Adam immediately doesn't like this idea. He's like, dude, Raphael warned us about an enemy. We should stay together for safety. And Eve says, if there's an enemy, he'll attack whether we're together or apart. Are we supposed to be living in fear? Besides, God gave us reason and free will. I should be able to resist temptation by myself, not just because you're watching me. And this is interesting because Eve's not wrong exactly. She's right that she would be able to resist temptation on her own. The problem is she's underestimating the enemy. She's thinking of temptation as this obvious external force. Satan's going to show up with horns announcing, I'm here to tempt you. And she doesn't understand that temptation is subtle, that it disguises itself as reason. So, they have this little argument about it, this little marriage argument about it. And then Adam doesn't want to force her to stay with him because that would violate her free will. And if he forces her, then her disobedience is meaningless. So he reluctantly agrees to split up, even though he's uncomfortable with it. And this is where the proverbial crap hits the proverbial fan. Not because Eve ate the fruit, we're not there yet, but because they've separated. Because they've gave Satan the opportunity to isolate her. So Eve goes about her day, goes about the section of the garden that she starts working. She's tending flowers, she's pruning plants, humming to herself probably, completely at peace. And then she hears a voice, a serpent's voice, a silly little snake. And it's speaking words, actual human language. Eve's shocked because animals don't talk. She's just like, what? How can you speak? And the serpent says, oh, I couldn't before, but then I ate from the special tree and I could suddenly speak and reason. It's incredible. You should try it. And Eve's curious. She's just like, oh, what tree are you talking about, young man? And then the serpent leads her throughout the garden, and then Milton describes Satan's internal state during this, and it's rather fascinating. Satan is feeling multiple things at once. He's really excited that his plan is working out, but he's also just disgusted with himself, as he should be, for what he's about to do. He sees Eve's innocence and beauty, and part of him wants to protect it. But the larger part of him wants to destroy it, because if he can't have innocence and happiness, no one can. So Satan leads Eve to the tree of knowledge, and then Eve immediately recognizes it and says, oh yeah, like this is the tree I'm not supposed to eat from. And Satan's just like, really? Really? God said, don't eat from this tree, plain innocent. And Eve says, well, yeah, we can eat from any other tree, but not this one. God said, if we eat from this tree, we will die. And this is Satan's opening. He says, die? You won't die. Look at me. I eat from it. I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than fine. I was just a dumb animal before, but now I'm intelligent. This tree doesn't cause death. It actually causes enlightenment. Eve, of course, is skeptical, but she says, but God said we'd die. And Satan says, think about it. Why would God not want you to eat from the tree of knowledge? What's so dangerous about knowledge? Unless God's lying to you. Unless he doesn't want you to have knowledge, because if you have knowledge, you'll be like him. You'll be his equal. And he doesn't want that, because he wants to keep you subordinate. And this is the core of the temptation. Satan's not saying disobey God. He's just saying God's lying to you. God's oppressing you, and this really isn't disobedience. It's just liberating for you. It's claiming what's rightfully yours. So he's taking his own justification for rebellion, I deserve equality with God, and he's projecting it onto Eve, like the true gaslighter he is. He's making her fall sound like his fall, making her sin sound like his sin. Eve's thinking about this. The fruit looks beautiful, it smells amazing, and the serpent seems fine after eating it. And the idea of knowledge is attractive. She's curious. She wants to understand more about the world. She wants to grow. Satan keeps pushing. He even says, even if God is telling the truth about death, which he's not, but even if he is, would God really destroy his entire creation over one piece of fruit? That seems petty. That seems beneath him. He's probably just testing you to see if you're brave enough to seize knowledge for yourself. And that breaks her for a moment. That argument. The idea that eating the fruit is an act of courage, of growth, of self-determination, Satan has successfully reframed disobedience into virtue. Eve reaches up and plucks the fruit from the tree. She holds it, and then she looks at it, and then Milton says that the earth groans. Like the physical planet responds to what's about to happen. Nature itself is mourning what is coming. And Eve takes the bite. And immediately she feels different. She feels this rush of sensation and emotion, like her mind is expanding, like she's seen things clearly for the first time. But what she's actually experiencing is the knowledge of good and evil. She now knows what evil is, and she now knows what sin is. And by knowing it, she's becoming capable of it. She's lost her innocence. Satan, watching this from nearby, is utterly thrilled. He's accomplished his goal. He's corrupted God's perfect creation. And he slips away back to hell to celebrate his victory. But Eve's not done. She stands there eating more of the fruit, and she starts thinking. And her thoughts are different now. They're selfish in a way that they weren't before. She thinks, this is amazing. I feel powerful. I feel like I'm becoming divine. Should I tell Adam? And then she thinks, but well, what if this really does kill me? What if I die and then Adam lives forever? God will just make him a new Eve. He's going to be with another woman. I can't have that. And then she thinks, or what if Adam eats it too and then we both be gods together? That's clearly better. So she decides to find Adam and convince him to eat too. Not for his benefit, but for hers. Because she doesn't want to face the consequences alone. And this is the first act of selfishness in human history. The first time that someone makes a decision purely for their own benefit at someone else's potential expense. Sin has entered her heart. Eve runs through the garden looking for Adam, and she finds him, and he's made something for her while she was gone. He's woven a crown of flowers because he was thinking about her and wanted to surprise her with a gift. And then Eve approaches this poor dude holding the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she's smiling, excited, and she says, Adam, you won't believe what happened. I found this tree, and I ate from it, and I feel incredible. Here, you should try it. And Adam looks at the fruit in her hand, and he immediately knows what it is. And his whole world stops. Milton describes this moment in such devastating detail. Adam just stands there frozen. not listening to what Eve's saying about how great the fruit is. He's just staring at her, realizing what she's done. In the flower crown that he's holding, Milton says, "From his slack hand, the garland wreathed for Eve dropped down, and all the faded roses shed." The roses in the crown were alive and fresh a moment ago, but the instant Eve sinned, death entered the world and the flowers started dying. And Adam drops the crown, and the faded roses fall to the ground. And I don't know why, but that image kind of destroys me every time I think about it. The crown of flowers, the symbol of Adam's innocent love for Eve, dropping and decaying the moment she sins. And it's interesting because Jesus had the crown of thorns, which is like the opposite. Like, it's such a small detail, but it captures the entire tragedy for the fall in one image. The last act of perfect love is literally falling apart. Adam's first words are heartbreaking. He says, "Eve, what have you done?" And Eve's just talking about how great the fruit is, how enlightened she feels, how Adam should join her so that they can be gods together. And Adam's not listening. In true male fashion, he's just thinking. He realizes his options. Eve has sinned. She's going to die. And that's what God said. And when she dies, Adam will be alone. Now, God might make a new companion for him, but it won't be Eve. It'll be someone else. And Adam realizes that he can't bear that. He can't imagine existence without Eve. He loves her more than anything. And Milton emphasizes this point. Adam is not deceived. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that the fruit is forbidden. He knows that eating it is sin, and he knows that it'll destroy everything. But he decides to do it anyway, because he'd rather be damned with Eve than be in paradise without her. And so Adam, fully aware of the consequences, takes the fruit from Eve's hand and eats it. And Milton says that the earth trembled from her entrails. The corruption is complete, both humans have sinned, and paradise is lost. And at first, they don't feel the full weight of it. They feel this rush of sensation similar to what Eve felt. And the first thing you feel is lust. Before the fall, Adam and Eve's relationship was described as pure and loving. Their physical intimacy was part of that purity, but now for the first time, they look at each other with lust and with selfish desire. And they have intercourse, but it's described as different from before. It's more violent, it's more urgent, it's more about taking than giving. And then afterward, they fall asleep. And when they wake up, everything is different. They feel the shame. They look at their naked bodies, and for the first time, they're embarrassed. They rush to cover themselves with fig leaves. They feel guilt. They realize what they've done. And then they understand that they've broken literally the one rule that they were given. They feel fear. They're terrified of facing God, terrified of what's coming. And ultimately, they feel something else. They feel anger at each other. Adam looks at Eve and starts yelling. He says, "This is your fault. You left me. You didn't listen to my warning. You ate the fruit and then you convinced me to eat it. Everything is ruined because of you." And then Eve yells back. She says, "You didn't have to eat it. I didn't force you. And besides, where were you? Why didn't you protect me? You're supposed to be the strong one, and then you just gave in immediately." And then they go back and forth, blaming each other. And it's the first argument in human history. The first time the people who loved each other perfectly now hate each other. And then Milton ends the scene by saying, "In mutual accusation spent the fruitless hours, but neither self-condemning." They're blaming each other, but neither of them are taking responsibility for their own choices. That's what sin does. It fractures relationships. It turns love into resentment. It makes us point fingers instead of looking inward. And that's where book 9 ends. Paradise has been lost. Death has entered the world. Adam and Eve are broken, but the story is not over yet, because God's about to show up and there are consequences to face. I'm going to cover books 10 through 12 in the same section as well, because book 10 opens up with Satan flying back to hell, and he's ecstatic. He's done it. He's corrupted humanity. He's hurt God in the worst way possible. And while he's been gone, sin and death have been busy. Remember how Satan promised them that they could leave hell if he succeeded? Well, they've been building a bridge, a massive physical bridge stretching from hell all the way to earth. And now that Adam and Eve have sinned, the bridge is completely passable. Sin and death cross the bridge and enter earth, and then they immediately start corrupting everything. Death begins killing animals. The prey starts attacking prey. Predators emerge. Things that were immortal start dying, and sin starts spreading corruption throughout the environment. Thorns grow, weeds spread, the weather becomes more harsh and unpredictable. Earth is ultimately transforming from paradise into a world of struggle and suffering before their very eyes. Meanwhile, Satan reaches Pandemonium, and all the demons gather to hear his report. Satan stands before them and announces his victory, expecting cheers and celebration. But instead, the moment he finishes speaking, he transforms. His body twists and shrinks and becomes a serpent. A massive serpent, but still, he's still crawling on the ground, humiliated. And the same thing happens to all the demons in Pandemonium. They all turn into serpents, slithering around on the floor, hissing and writhing. And these trees grow up around them, bearing fruit that looks like the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent demons are starving, so they try to eat the fruit. But every time they bite into it, it turns into ash in their mouths. It's bitter and choking and terrible. And this happens over and over and over again. They reach for the fruit, hoping it'll satisfy them, bite into it, and then it turns into ash. It's torture. They're literally trapped in this cycle of desire and disappointment. And Milton says that this happens annually. Every year on the anniversary of the fall, all the demons transform into serpents and experience this humiliation. It's God's reminder that they're literally not the conquerors here, they're the prisoners. They didn't win, they just dragged humanity down with him. And that's the last we see of Satan in this poem. His story ends not in glory, but in humiliation, in futility, crawling on the ground, eating ash. All his grand speeches about reigning in hell, about building a kingdom, about freedom, it all collapses into this pathetic image. Meanwhile, though, in the garden, Adam and Eve are spiraling. They've been arguing for hours, they've been miserable, they're terrified, and they don't know what to do. And then they hear God's voice calling for them. They end up hiding, and they're ashamed to face God, covering themselves with leaves and trying to disappear into the bushes. But God ultimately finds them. Well, not God the Father. The Son comes to earth to handle the judgment here. But remember, the Son is the one who eventually will become Jesus and die for humanity's sins. So he's the merciful face of God. He's the one who deals with humans directly. So the Son asks, why are you hiding? And Adam says, well, because we're naked and we're ashamed. And the Son asks, well, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? And Adam, in this so human and pathetic way, Adam says, well, yes, but it's not my fault. Eve gave me the fruit and you gave me Eve. So really, if you think about it, this is kind of your fault. So he's blaming God for his own choice. It's the most cowardly response possible. So Jesus turns to Eve and asks, well, what about you? What's your excuse? And then Eve says, the serpent tricked me, which is, at least the more honest answer than Adam's answer. She's not blaming God, but she's still not taking full responsibility either. The Son sighs and then pronounces judgment. To the serpent, or rather to Satan through the serpent, he says, you're cursed. You'll crawl on your belly and humanity will be at war with you forever. You'll bite their heel, but they'll crush your head. And this is the first prophecy of Christ's victory over Satan. The crushing the head part refers to Jesus defeating Satan at the crucifixion and the resurrection. To Eve, he says, you'll experience pain in childbirth, and your relationship with your husband will be complicated. You'll desire him, but he'll have authority over you. But I think Milton is saying that this is a consequence of sin, not God's ideal design. The brokenness between men and women is part of the fall, not necessarily part of creation. To Adam, he says, well, the ground is now cursed. You'll have to work for food. You'll have to toil and sweat and struggle. Thorns and weeds will grow, and eventually you'll just die. You came from dust, and from dust you'll return. Then Jesus does something merciful. He kills animals, their first deaths, and then uses their skins to make clothes for Adam and Eve because the fig leaves that they made aren't enough. And this is symbolic of sacrifice, innocent blood shed to cover their shame. It's ultimately pointing towards the ultimate sacrifice of Christ, but there's still that one question to get out of the way on what to do with them. They can't stay in the garden because the garden also has the tree of life, and if they eat from the tree of life in their fallen state, they'll become immortal sinners locked in corruption forever with no possibility of redemption. So they have to leave, and this is where Michael, the chief angel, shows up. He's been sent to expel them from Eden, but before he does, God tells them to give them hope, to show them that this isn't the end of the story. So Michael puts Eve to sleep and then gives her dreams for the future, comforting her about her descendants and the eventual salvation of humanity. And while she sleeps, Michael takes Adam to a high mountain. And it's from this mountain that Michael shows Adam visions of the future, all of human history compressed into a series of prophetic scenes. The first Adam sees two men in a field, brothers, and then one of them kills the other. This is Cain and Abel, Adam's own sons. And Adam is horrified at this. He's just like, this is death? Like, this is what I brought into the world? Michael says, yes, this is what sin does. And then Michael shows Adam more. He shows him wars, diseases, famines, and then he shows him the empires rising and falling. He shows him humanity's capacity for cruelty and violence. And Adam's devastated, watching the consequences of his choice ripple throughout history. But Michael also shows him hope. He shows him Noah in the flood, God's judgment, but also God's mercy preserving a remnant. He shows him Abraham in the promise of a great nation. What else does he show him? He shows him Moses and the Exodus, the lineage that will lead to the Messiah. And then when Michael tells Adam about Jesus, he explains that one day a descendant of Eve will be born who will be both fully human and fully God, or rather truly human and truly God. And he will live a perfect life. And then humans will kill him. But through his death, he'll pay the debt of sin. And through his resurrection, he'll defeat death itself. So at this point, Adam is just overwhelmed. He's like, so all this suffering, all this death, all this evil, it all leads to redemption. And Michael says, yeah, God's going to fix everything. Paradise will be lost, but one day paradise will be regained. And the new paradise will be even better than this one. Adam breaks down crying because he's experiencing the full range of human emotion now. Grief for what he's lost, shame for what he's done, but also hope for what was promised to him. Michael says one day after all of history plays out, after Christ returns, heaven and earth will be joined, and then the physical and spiritual will be unified. There'll be no more death, there'll be no more pain, no more separation from God, and you and Eve will be a part of that. And then Michael shows Adam one more thing. He shows him Judgment Day, the final battle between good and evil, Satan's ultimate defeat, the resurrection of the dead, the new heaven and the new earth. And Adam says, I'm starting to understand something. Paradise isn't just a place, it's a state of being. And even though we're leaving the garden, we can carry paradise with us if we stay faithful to God. And Michael says, exactly. You've lost the external paradise, but the internal paradise, the presence of God, that hope of redemption can never be taken from you. Then Michael leads Adam back down the mountain. Eve wakes up from her dreams, having been shown the same things in different form, and she's seen the future. She's seen the promise, and she's seen the hope. Michael tells them that it's time to go. And then there's this beautiful, heartbreaking scene where Adam and Eve take one last look at the garden. They look back at their home, the place where they were happy, the place where everything was just perfect. And they're crying because they know that they can never go back. Michael leads them to the eastern gate of the garden. And standing at the gate is now a cherubim, like I said, one of those intense multi-faced animals guarding with a flaming sword. And then the garden is sealed, and then nobody's getting back in. Adam and Eve step through the gate, and then they're in the world now, the fallen world, the world of death and struggle and pain. But they're together, and they have hope. And then Milton actually ends the poem with these lines. Where is that? Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them where to choose. Their place of rest and providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. The end. And that's the end. Adam and Eve walking away from paradise, hand in hand, into the unknown. It's tragic, but it's also somehow hopeful because they're not alone. They have each other, and they have God's promise that one day everything will be made right. All right, so we've talked through the entire story, but now I think we have to quickly talk about what it means. Because Paradise Lost isn't just retelling the story of the Bible, or at least Genesis. It's Milton wrestling with some of the deepest questions in theology and philosophy, and then there's a lot to unpack here. First, we have to talk about Satan, because Satan is what most people remember about this poem. And for good reason. He's one of the most compelling characters in all of literature, to be quite honest with you. And here's the thing that I think gets lost in a lot of modern readings. Satan is not the hero here. Milton is not endorsing his rebellion. What Milton's doing is much more sophisticated than that. He's showing you how evil justifies itself, how it disguises itself as virtue, and how it makes terrible things seem pretty reasonable. Like, just think about Satan's journey through the poem. In book 1, he's giving these defiant speeches about freedom and resistance. He sounds heroic, like he's rallying his troops, he's building a kingdom. like refusing to give up, like, that sort of thing. And if you only read book one, you might say, okay, I think Satan's got a point here. But as the story goes, the mask starts to slip. And by book two, he's manipulating his followers and using them for his own purposes. By book four, he's admitting to himself that he doesn't actually want forgiveness. He just wants power. And then by book nine, he's literally destroying innocence out of pure spite. And then by book 10, he's literally eating ash in the form of a serpent. He's a degenerate, both morally and literally. And he starts as this massive angelic being and he ends as a snake. That's not accidental. That's Milton showing you what evil does. It doesn't elevate, it rather degrades. People think that sin is liberating when it actually is the thing that's enslaving you. Satan's rhetoric about like self-determination and freedom is a lie that ultimately he tells himself to justify his pride. And the tragedy is that Satan knows this. That's what makes him such like a great character. He's not ignorant to his own, self-deception, but he's self-aware enough to see what he's become, but he's too proud to change. Like when he says, myself am hell, he's acknowledging that his torment is internal. Hell isn't a place, it's what he's turned himself into. And I think this is Milton's answer to people who read Satan as a sympathetic rebel. Yeah, Satan's words sound good. His speeches are persuasive. That's kind of like the point. Evil is persuasive. If it wasn't, nobody would choose it. But persuasive doesn't mean true. Satan's entire character is a warning. Don't confuse eloquent rhetoric with actual virtue. And now let's talk about the fall itself, because this is the emotional heart of the poem. The tragedy of the fall isn't that Adam and Eve were stupid or weak. The tragedy is that they were in love. Eve's tempted by curiosity. She wants knowledge. She wants to grow. But Adam isn't deceived at all. He actually knows what he's doing. He eats the fruit because he can't imagine existence without her. He chooses her over God. He chooses that love over obedience to God. And in any other story, that would also be heroic. That would be the romantic climax where the protagonist sacrifices everything for love. But here, it's the worst thing he possibly could do because his love ultimately is misdirected. He's loving a created thing more than the creator. He's loving Eve more than he loves truth, more than he loves God, more than he loves what's ultimately right. And that's the paradox of the fall. Adam's motivation is good, because love is a good thing, but the action itself that he takes is wrong. And that's what makes it tragic. It's not like a villain doing evil for evil's sake. It's a good person doing wrong for understandable reasons. And the aftermath is so painfully human too. As soon as they sin, they start fighting, they start blaming each other. Their perfect love degrades into resentment and accusation. And that's what sin does. It fractures relationships. It turns love into selfishness. But, here's the thing I think Milton wants us to understand. The fall was always a possible reality. It had to be possible because love without choice is not love. Obedience without the option without the option to disobey isn't obedience. It's programming, ultimately. God created Adam and Eve with free will because forced virtue isn't virtue at all. And that means that they could choose wrongly, and they did. And that broke everything. But, and this is the crucial point I want to make, God already had a plan, or rather that Milton wanted to make. Before Adam and Eve ever sinned, the Son had already volunteered to die for them. Redemption was built into creation from the very beginning. So the question isn't why did God let them fall? The question is, why did God create beings who could fall? And Milton's answer is, because love requires freedom. Real love, authentic love, can only exist between free beings. And freedom necessarily includes the possibility of choosing the wrong thing. So the fall is terrible, yes, but it's also the price of real love. God wanted beings who could love him freely, not robots programmed to obey him. And that meant accepting the risk that they might choose rebellion. And I think that's what Milton means when he says that Adam says at the very end that he carries paradise with him. Paradise isn't just the garden, it's the relationship with God. Paradise is almost this state of grace. And even though the physical garden is lost, the possibility of spiritual paradise remains. And now let's talk about Milton's life and how it influenced this poem, because I think Paradise Lost is deeply personal to Milton in ways that aren't always obvious. Milton, like I said, spent his whole life fighting for what he believed was a righteous cause. He supported the revolution against the king. He believed the monarchy was a tyranny that England could be free. And for a brief moment, it looked like he was right. The king was executed and the republic was established. But then it all fell apart. The republic became a military dictatorship under Cromwell, and then Cromwell died, and then the monarchy was restored, and like everything Milton fought for collapsed. And I think Milton was asking himself, like, was I wrong? Like, was my rebellion against the king like Satan's rebellion against God? Like, how do I tell the difference between like a righteous resistance and a prideful rebellion, you know? And Paradise Lost is his answer. Satan's rebellion looks righteous on the surface because he talks about freedom and resistance and tyranny and equality, but underneath it's just pride. Satan doesn't actually care about freedom for others. He just wants power for himself. But human rebellion is different. Humans sin, yes, but they sin out of weakness and love and confusion, not pure malice. And crucially, humans are offered redemption. Satan could have been forgiven if he had just asked, but he just never asked. Humans, on the other hand, are actively pursued by God's grace. So I think Milton's theodicy, his defense of God's justice, is partly defense of his own choices. He's saying, yeah, I rebelled against the king, but my rebellion was different from Satan's. Mine came from a desire for genuine freedom and justice. Satan's came from pride. And even when the righteous rebellions fail, even when the tyrants win, God's plan is still working and redemption is still possible. Which brings me to the ending, because the ending is where Milton's theology really shines through. Adam and Eve leave the garden. They're going into the world of suffering and death, but they're not despairing because they've been shown the future. They know that one day God himself is going to be coming to earth, that he'll live human, that he'll suffer and die, and that through his death and resurrection, everything will be made right. Paradise is lost, but paradise will be regained. And in the meantime, Adam and Eve have each other. They have hope. They have God's promise. And that's enough for them. There's this beautiful paradox in Christian theology that Milton's touching on here. It's sometimes called the Felix culpa, like the fortunate fall. The idea that the fall, as terrible as it was, led to something even better. Because without the fall, there never would have been Christ. He never would have needed to come. And Christ's sacrifice and the resulting redemption is seen as an even greater good than the original paradise. And Milton references this when Michael tells Adam that the new heaven and new earth will be better than the original garden. The redeemed world will be more glorious than the innocent world ever was. And I don't know if, that theology is interesting, and it takes a lot of suffering to get there, but I understand what Milton's trying to do. He's saying that even the worst things that humans have ever done, the thing that brought death and evil into the world, even that can be redeemed. Even that can be turned into good. And for Milton, writing in the 1660s, watching everything he fought for crumble, being blind and politically defeated, that's a powerful message. He's telling himself that this isn't the end. The tyrants may have won for now, but God has bigger than human politics. Justice will come, redemption will come, paradise will be regained. And I think that's why Paradise Lost has endured for 350 years. Because it's not just a retelling of Genesis, it's literally exploring how we make sense of suffering, how we understand free will, and how we live in a world how we live with hope in a broken world. The poem doesn't answer all the questions it raises. Honestly, I don't think any work of theology can, but it asks the right questions. And it does so with such a beautiful, powerful language that even when you disagree with Milton's conclusions, you have to respect what he's attempting. And it created Satan as we know him, the conflicted, sympathetic, self-justifying antagonist. Every villain sense who makes good points but is ultimately wrong, they are descendants of Milton's Satan. Every story about how love can lead us astray, that's Paradise Lost. Every free will idea and its consequences, Milton got us there first. So yeah, Paradise Lost matters. Not just as literature, not just as theology, but as this foundational text that has shaped how Western culture thinks about good and evil, free will and determinism, love and obedience, and rebellion and redemption. It's just Milton's attempt to justify the ways of God to men, to explain why God allows suffering, why evil exists, and why good people fail. And whether he succeeds or not is kind of up to you, but the attempt itself is worth reading. So that's Paradise Lost, the story of how an angel's pride destroyed paradise, how humanity's love corrupted innocence, and how God's grace promised redemption, all told in 12 books of epic poetry by a blind Puritan revolutionary hiding from the king. It's a lot, but it's worth it. Thank you so much for watching this. I know this was long, probably one of my longest videos ever, or at least close. But Paradise Lost deserves the kind of treatment because it's not a story that I can just summarize in 10 minutes. and you have to wrestle with it and sit with it. Let it kind of like unfold, I guess. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you seriously enjoyed this and want more biblical theological deep dives, I have so much stuff on that. And there's a part 2 to this. It's called Paradise Regained. You know, I'll probably cover that at some point. Let me know if you want that in the comments, where he covers Jesus's temptation in the wilderness and his resistance to Satan. That had no influence on my, wilderness video that I just posted, but that's also interesting. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for indulging me in this extremely long video about a 17th century epic poem. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.